The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 11. The Department of Weather Management. Thaddeus, Lorena's boyfriend, was a very old soul and a member of the hierarchy. Thaddeus had graduated the physical during the zenith of the Lemurian civilization, which was relatively recent history compared to the length of time man has actually been roaming the planet. The conclusion of a soul's ascension is typically a personal event, but the collective attainment of it has happened in pockets all over the world throughout vast spans of time. The ushering in of a new age or the closing out of an old age has often been heralded by the sinking of land masses or the rising up of new ones. Thaddeus looked at his watch, happy to see that Lorena had sent him a smiley face and a bunch of kisses. They had planned to watch old movies and eat popcorn together, but his workload had not permitted it. Thaddeus had just initiated another plug pulling, as some at the department referred to it. An imperceptible seismic shift under a metre length of railway track was scheduled to occur within the hour. The track would buckle and the train heading toward it would derail. On board in the first carriage, a man named Patrick was reading a newspaper. His life would end on paragraph 2 of the sports section. Earlier that morning, a series of water projects had kept Thaddeus very busy. The River Severn in England would burst at precisely 6:26 p.m. 3 days previously, he had opened the heavens as a precursor. 2 tidal surges had been scheduled, and the blockage of a large urban drainage system had already been completed. The flash flooding was due to cause a great deal of panic, as well as 26 deaths and a plethora of injuries. Thaddeus shook his head ruefully. He remembered his first water project as if it had been yesterday. Melchizedek had walked into the room and straight over to Thaddeus's cubicle. Back then he was just a junior rainmaker. Melchizedek asked Thaddeus to flood a third of the world, giving him less than 5 minutes to implement the task. Initiating this kind of mass culling was never a popular job, but Thaddeus had done as he was told without twitching. He had been promoted to department head the following day. The great flood of folklore in many cultures was ordered by Melchizedek, not because he was angry, disappointed, or in any way vengeful, but because the karma of several million souls needed balancing before their personal evolution could recommence. The sudden rise of water had been a swift and certain means of karmic disbursement. It did not take 40 days and 40 nights of torrential rain, as recorded in the old book. With Melchizedek looking on, Thaddeus configured a quicker means of delivery. During the winter of the year 3015 BC, a 4-mile-wide comet crashed into the ocean off the coast of Madagascar, causing a tsunami so big that the world's population was almost cut in half. Contrary to most mythology on the subject, Melchizedek had never once been disappointed in his creations and never acted out of vengeance. His plan simply meant that every soul who sowed poorly reaped poorly. Since that day, Thaddeus had cultivated a high degree of indifference regarding the consequences of his actions, an indifference that many members of his team did not find quite so easy to muster. Consequently, Thaddeus volunteered to take on much of the dirty work, which kept him incredibly busy. Thaddeus understood that his work was vital to the spiritual growth of the human species. More so recently, Mother Nature was increasingly used as a wake-up call. Man was born to consciously engage his mind, and those who had found a means of avoiding doing this often needed a divine nudge to get back on course, especially those living in the modern world who were bombarded with external stimuli so completely that mental lethargy had taken root. This month's wake-up call projects were in the hands of an up-and-coming rainmaker Thaddeus intended to promote if he continued to show such high levels of proficiency. Lorena would be very happy about that. She had recently remarked that he should learn to delegate, and he had smiled and told her that perhaps she was right. But Lorena had no idea of the weight he had on his shoulders. How could she? Implicit in his role as rainmaker was the installation of fear. Thaddeus had a lot of compassion for those who had chosen to be injected with it in their life plans. Being swept up in a tornado, ravished by a brush fire, or enveloped by a tidal wave was always a terrifying ordeal, but dying was not the most terrifying part. Death was, more often than not, an ecstatic release than anything else. It was the lead-up to the death that most souls felt to be the most challenging aspect of their grand finale. The terrifying precursor to death was often the karmic point behind the entire ordeal, its purpose. In whatever manner it came to him, once the soul had experienced a mirror of fear he had previously caused another, he was released from his body and could either watch the aftermath from a few feet above or head starside and into the arms of a waiting guide. In some cases, the karmic exposure to fear only needed to be seconds, but in other cases minutes or hours, and sometimes days or weeks. But no soul was forced to endure the wrath of God longer than necessary. "Remember," Thaddeus said Melchizedek on the day of his promotion, "the way Mother Nature expresses herself is in complete harmony with the way in which man expresses himself. Mother Nature holds within herself the energetic capacity to be violent and extreme, or moderate and tranquil, and as man continues to harness his thoughts, leading to a rise in his level of consciousness and an improvement in his actions, you, my friend, as department head, will respond accordingly." Although frowned upon by Melchizedek, Thaddeus held certain souls in higher esteem than others, namely those who had risen above the need to act on ancient injunctions to gain dominion over their environment. Jane was an example of an enlightened being who quite naturally respected the world around her, and therefore Mother Nature quite naturally respected her in return. Thaddeus smiled as he recalled his morning schedule. It was Jane's wedding day. At the exact moment the church bells tolled, Jane and the photographer were delighted when the sun's rays pierced through the clouds. Rain had been forecast that day. Jane was a nurse at a local hospice, and a gentle one, with a bedside manner that was a comfort to all who needed her support. Jane was not only kind to her fellow man, but took in and rehoused stray animals, fed the birds, planted seeds, and was careful not to stab earthworms when planting bulbs. Tomorrow morning Thaddeus would personally see to it that Jane's flight to Malaga would be turbulence-free and the weather on her honeymoon would be idyllic. Thaddeus would keep Jane in the palm of his hand, and he couldn't wait for the day that the entire world would be sitting alongside her. Jane's grandfather, Rod McCallan, was an 81-year-old subsistence farmer and lived in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. He also had Mother Nature wrapped around his little finger. Rod McCallan's crops always flourished. His tomato plants would become an attraction this year, and his cucumbers were already too big for most to handle, his radishes bursting with a perfect peppery flavour on their way to resembling apples. Rod McCallan would share all he grew with his neighbours, who would return the favour with a demijohn of homemade wine. Rod McCallan and the little community of souls that prospered alongside him lived in a secluded pocket of the world that Mother Nature ensured was benign, temperate and life-affirming. Mother Nature was just an energetic reflection of the nature of the souls who lived there. Rod McCallan was looking forward to the birth of his first great-grandchild. He dreamed that night that his granddaughter Jane, who lived in Shoreham on the south coast of England, had just arrived home from her honeymoon and had called to announce that she was expecting her first child. The dream had seemed so real. Thaddeus took his attention to tomorrow's schedule, which was packed. Godsons were omnipotent, but not omniscient, and therefore do not do all that must be done to care for an existing planetary system. Thus, it was the job of those at the Department of Weather Management to establish and maintain the precise focus during the configuration stage of any meteorological event, significant or trivial. With specific sectors under their jurisdiction, rainmakers direct their car energy, the name the ancient Egyptians gave to vital energy, to align the forces of nature with meticulous precision, and Thaddeus was always on hand to help supplement that energy, as well as tweak and modify the configuration. After that, there wasn't much left for a rainmaker to do other than to sit back and watch the earth, water, wind, fire and air do their thing. Thaddeus noted that Parish 11 had a very heavy workload during the coming week, but he wasn't concerned. He ran a tight but relaxed ship. Every parish had sufficient time to prepare due to the fact that the timing and manner of a soul's karmic debt was always pre-calibrated. During the planning stage of the life she was about to exit, Tamika Tomlin had decided it was time to pay her karmic debt. She and her guide had worked out the finer details, and both were happy that her karma would this time around be settled. To be karma-free was always considered a big coup, especially for younger souls. Guides always began planning sessions with very similar words of warning. If you kill another, do not expect to be killed by a fellow human. Mother Nature is on standby and knows exactly where to find you. This mitigates the need for human involvement as well as the need for a dispenser. Please understand the logic of this. Tamika had, and she'd been happy about it. Creating an endless assortment of weather systems required the concentrated focus of thought form energy, beginning what was nonchalantly referred to Starside as creative visualization. Creative visualization was not only an integral part of creation in the Ascension program, this conscious practice from which the unmanifest takes material form, it constituted much of what was required to keep the forces of nature active and precise Starside. Anything from seismic ruptures to dust bowls to cyclones to sinkholes to avalanches were called into being by advanced souls who had postponed their higher learning in favour of assisting the Godson Starside. Thaddeus moved to the T's. Tomorrow morning a tornado was scheduled to blast through Tamika's trailer park. She was scheduled to die at the age of 20 in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Her death was scheduled to be violent but quick. The tornado was to be configured by a junior rainmaker at Parish 11, which governed the Americas. Prior to being born, Tamika had chosen this encounter with Mother Nature to balance her karma, relating to a life she had lived as Vladimir Chenikov in Russia in 1896. Vladimir had a devious penchant for injecting drama into every situation he encountered, and he helped spark the rumours that resulted in the painful deaths of a large number of people being crushed by stampeding hordes fleeing the Kondyka fields in Moscow. Everyone was there to celebrate Tsar Nicholas's II coronation, but what should have been a happy celebration ended in disaster. Vladimir escaped the carnage and later moved to a small town on the Baltic Sea, where he died a few years later of tuberculosis. After returning Starside, and from the vantage point of his greater awareness, Vladimir felt terrible about what had happened and felt that the karmic debt from his Russian life needed to be fulfilled before the opportunity for any further growth could be considered. His guide had agreed. The old adage, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, meant exactly that. If one was responsible for blinding another with a sharp stick, he too would be blinded, but not necessarily by a sharp stick. It could be the wind sending airborne a loose piece of concrete, or a dangerous and precisely placed jellyfish sting while snorkeling. Karmic disbursement is not always literal, and only when a soul had returned Starside was he or she able to make the obvious correlation. A soul responsible for irrevocably maiming another or causing that soul painful and drawn-out health problems may encounter a snake while hiking. A snake whose well-placed venom leads to an infection, then a skin graft, then an amputation. If one was responsible for kidnapping another and holding them captive, he too would have to experience how that felt for the same duration of time, which could involve being trapped under earthquake rubble for several long weeks prior to death with broken limbs and a broken spirit. Off the clock, Thaddeus took very little seriously, which was a good attitude to possess in the line of work that could be considered morbid. While on the clock, Thaddeus's attention to detail ensured that even the minutest deviations in weather formations were remedied before collateral damage occurred. Not even the wing of a butterfly had ever been damaged on his watch. Thaddeus stood and stretched as he looked out of the window at the square below. Although it was pushing midnight, the square was a mass of activity. A lot of souls whom Mother Nature had very recently brought home were with their guides and on their way to the Department of Returns. All had broad grins on their faces, and many were laughing despite the fact that most had undergone horrific deaths. Thaddeus sent forth loving energy to them all. Thaddeus sat back down. He had a couple of minor but significant tweaks to make before he could retire for the night. He sent Lorena, his girlfriend, a smiley face and a bunch of hearts and hoped she was sleeping like a baby at home in their big double bed with their 2 cats.